Jaime Lannister stood upon the battlements of the Red Keep, gazing across the rooftops and winding streets of King's Landing. Dawn had not yet broken, and a pale gray light dusted the city as though in delicate caution. He rested his golden hand on the cold stone merlin and felt a prickle of restless energy run through his body. Once, this city had been a great prize for his family to keep in its grasp, a symbol of power and intimidation. Now it felt like a hollow shell. The war had stripped the realm, leaving behind little but hungry peasants, suspicious nobles, and a sense that it had all cost too much. And winter approached, no one could deny that. The wind carried the chill from the north even this far south, as if to warn them that time was short and the living had best unite or perish in the snows. He turned at the sound of footsteps behind him. Brienne of Tarth emerged from the shadows, her face solemn. She wore no cloak, only her plate and mail, as if always prepared for a threat. There had been so many threats these past few years. Jaime had once lost faith that the realm could ever heal, but Brienne had opened his eyes to a different way. Duty, honor, commitment to something larger than his own reputation. These were what drove her, and he found himself unexpectedly drawn to a cause worth fighting for that went beyond Lannister pride. He gave her a slight smile, his hand drifting from the merlin to his side. "There's frost in the air," Brienne said quietly. "I can feel it. Even here." Jaime nodded. "Aye, we can't avoid the seasons, can we?" He paused and flexed the fingers of his remaining hand. "Or what's coming with them?" She watched him with that steady, forthright gaze that had once unsettled him. Now, it merely reminded him there were decent souls still in this world. "Have you decided?" she asked. Jaime lifted his golden hand, examining its glint in the dull pre-dawn light. "Yes," he said, voice nearly inaudible. "Tyrion told me once that the true war is in the north, that what marches beyond the wall doesn't care for names or claims. And you and I saw enough while traveling together to know the truth. We waste our strength on petty disputes. If we keep on as we have, the living will tear itself apart before the dead even arrive." Brienne's expression grew grim. "So you mean to propose a truce with the Starks?" "A full truce," Jaime confirmed. He turned to face the city again, as if he could see an army of the dead cresting the horizon. "It's time all of us stood together. The only way is to show them we are sincere. Our word is worthless if we don't offer something in good faith, and the Lannisters have never been good at generosity without cunning strings attached." He took a breath. "I intend to change that. Not for glory, not for gold, but because it's necessary." She let a small breath slip between her lips, though she kept her composure. Brienne had never been one for exuberance in her gestures, but Jaime saw the faint relief in her eyes. "I will ride with you," she said. "Of course you will," Jaime responded with a wry twist of a smile. "I'll need you there. The Northmen trust you more than they'll ever trust me." He looked over the city once more, imagining the day when he would ride out of the gates with a small retinue to treat with the Starks. A generation of betrayal and bloodshed lay between House Lannister and House Stark, but if any man could attempt to bridge that gap now, he supposed he would have to be the one. This was the realm's last chance, everyone's last chance. They descended the walls together, boots echoing on the stone stairs. The Red Keep was stirring as servants carried logs to light fires in the chilly corridors, their breath escaping in pale wisps. Jaime inhaled the faint scent of wood smoke. He remembered other mornings in this castle. As a young man wearing white armor he hadn't yet tarnished, as a callow youth with easy swagger, as a king's guard to a madman, as a man scorned for a single act that had saved thousands. Everything he had done led to this moment, and he felt the weight of it pressing upon him. In the hall outside the Queen's Solar, 2 Lannister guards stood watch. Jaime's heart felt tight at the thought of seeing Cersei again. So much between them was broken beyond repair, yet their fates had always been intertwined. He ran a gauntlet hand over his short hair, face set. Brienne lingered a respectful distance behind him, letting him face his sister first. Cersei awaited him in the Solar with wine already poured and a haunted look in her eyes. The last few months had not been kind to her, and the lines of worry and fury were etched deeply into her once radiant features. The crown sat on a small side table, as if even that was too heavy for her at the moment. She clasped a goblet, swirling the dark red liquid inside. "You called me to a dawn meeting, brother?" she said, voice clipped. "I don't care for dawn meetings. It reminds me of all the times Father insisted on tutelage at sunrise." Jaime took a few steps into the room. The solar smelled of bitter perfume and the ashes of last night's fire. He glanced at the wine in her goblet but refused to pour himself any. "This couldn't wait," he replied. She narrowed her eyes at him. "And you brought your lady knight with you. Good to see the rumors that Jaime Lannister is under the thrall of a Tarth wench are true. But let's get to the point. My time is limited." He felt a flicker of anger at her casual disdain, but also a profound sadness that things had come to this. He cleared his throat. "Cersei, the realm stands on the brink of destruction. I've pledged to treat with the Starks, to propose a truce, one that might unite us and prepare us for what lies north." Cersei's knuckles whitened around the goblet. For a moment, she looked ready to lash out, but then she let out a sharp exhale. "A truce with the Starks? How many times must the Starks and Lannisters clash before we realize there is no peace between our houses? We've spilled enough blood. The Starks have lost as much as we have," Jaime said. "The people are starving, the winter threatens, and the dead gather beyond the wall. You've heard the rumors from the Night's Watch. They need men. They need alliances. All the South squabbles over who sits the Iron Throne while an army of nightmares creeps toward our gates. What good will it do us to hold King's Landing if every living soul in Westeros is devoured? You've seen visions of dragons, you've heard the ravens from the wall. Even you cannot think to stand alone if the dead come. And whose fault is that?" Cersei spat. "These times have been shaped by traitors and oathbreakers. By the Starks, by everyone who challenged House Lannister. If the realm is on the brink, blame them, not me." Jaime felt the old frustration flaring. There had been a time he would parrot her words, share her perspectives. But that time was gone. He said quietly, "It doesn't matter anymore who is at fault. All that matters now is survival." Cersei took a measured breath, her face an unreadable mask. "You've already decided, haven't you? You plan to ride north yourself." She turned her gaze to Brienne, who stood by the door, listening in silence. "And you trust him, do you? If the Starks capture him, do you think they'll spare him out of some sense of honor?" Brienne did not flinch under Cersei's scrutiny. "I trust Ser Jaime to do what is necessary," she said, calm and steadfast. "And I trust the Starks to listen if we present a fair offer." Cersei studied Brienne for another heartbeat, then returned her gaze to Jaime. "You want my blessing, or you want my permission? You're not getting either. Do as you will. Run off to the Starks and beg for mercy, or call it an alliance if that eases your pride. But don't expect me to bow or to risk my own hold on power for the sake of the North." Jaime knew she would react like this. He set his jaw and spoke in a softer tone. "Once upon a time, you and I dreamed of forging a better world for our family. Dreams die, yes, but winter does not care about our grudges. I'm not asking you to bow. I only hope you see reason before it's too late." His words seemed to wash over her like rain on stone. She remained rigid, full of bitterness. "Get out," she said through gritted teeth. "Take whatever men you can convince to follow you. But do not come crawling back to me when the Starks put your head on a spike. And if you fail up there, well, I'll find some other means to defend this city." He dipped his head in acknowledgement, though his chest felt hollow. "Goodbye, Cersei." She would not meet his gaze, and he turned to the door, Brienne following close behind. The corridor outside felt strangely liberating, though the clang of his boots on the floor echoed with finality. He knew in his bones that this was the last conversation of any intimacy he would have with Cersei. Let her cling to her throne. The war that mattered was not about chairs and crowns anymore. They descended through the keep until they reached the courtyard, where a trickle of men were gathering, some wearing the crimson and gold of House Lannister, others wearing no sigil but pledged by personal loyalty to Jaime rather than to the Queen. He had called them to hear his plan, though he expected fewer than half would volunteer to ride north. The realm had fragmented itself through fear and suspicion. As they reached the assembled group, Jaime removed a pair of riding gloves from his belt and slipped them on. He looked over the men. Some wore uncertain expressions, but a surprising number bore resolute stares. He lifted his voice for them all to hear. "Those of you who stand before me, I've called you here to inform you of our next move. We will ride north to Winterfell, seeking an audience with the Starks. Our purpose is to propose a truce, one that might allow us to join forces before the threat beyond the wall descends upon us all." A faint murmur rippled through the men. Jaime continued, "We all know this war has cost us dearly, but every rumor from the north tells of a far greater danger than any king or queen. The long night is coming again, so the old stories say. We must unite or die. I do not command you to accompany me. Each man who rides with me does so of his own free will." Slowly, men stepped forward, heads bowed in a quiet pledge. They were not numerous, but Jaime recognized in them a courage that was born not out of blind loyalty, but out of a sense of necessity and the desire to protect something bigger than themselves. Brienne moved through them, nodding encouragement to any who hesitated. Ser Adam Richards, a seasoned Lannister officer with a streak of silver in his hair, stepped forward. "Ser Jaime, you saved my life once, on the battlefield against the Tully forces. If we have a chance to avert more bloodshed, and if there truly is a nightmarish army out there, I'll stand with you." Jaime placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Thank you, Ser Adam. Let us hope we can make a difference." He raised his voice again. "Prepare yourselves. We leave at midday. Take only what you need. We ride with all speed, for the weather grows crueler by the day." A few men drifted away to complete their preparations. Others lingered to speak in low voices, uncertain but willing. Jaime felt something stir within him, hope perhaps. It had been a long time since he'd felt such a straightforward sense of purpose. Brienne joined him near the stables. They stood among the smells of hay and horse sweat as grooms prepared saddles. Jaime watched them work. "We won't be a big force," he said, "but enough to show we mean business, and not so many that the Starks think we're preparing for war." Brienne nodded. "It's wise. They will be wary. They have reason to distrust us." He turned to her fully, and for a moment, all the unspoken tension between them, respect, gratitude, a kind of reluctant affection, hovered. He said quietly, "I know you never imagined you'd be riding to Winterfell with Jaime Lannister, asking the Starks for peace. Life has its twists." She gave him a small smile. "Honor sometimes leads us to unexpected crossroads, Ser Jaime." Indeed, he could still remember the day she had sworn to protect the Stark girls. That vow had led her through so many dangers. He wondered if Sansa Stark would remember the tall, valiant woman who had tried to keep her safe in King's Landing, or if Arya Stark was even still alive somewhere. So many threads tangled in war. By midday, they were mounted and filing out of the Red Keep's gates. Jaime wore simple plate, unadorned by golden lions, and a crimson cloak that bore only the faint outline of the Lannister crest. A sign, he hoped, that this venture was not an act of aggression. The small party, no more than 100 men, rode out, hooves clopping against the cobblestones. Citizens of King's Landing watched from windows or street corners, some ignoring them entirely, others eyeing them with suspicion. To most, they were only knights and soldiers on some errand. They did not realize that perhaps the fate of the realm turned on this departure. Once free of the city's walls, the company made its way north along the Rose Road. The countryside bore the scars of war, blackened fields, scorched farmsteads, and an eerie quiet that told of famine and fear. Jaime found himself feeling more weight, as though each abandoned home was a ghost that tugged at his conscience. He had done his share of fighting, of burning. He could not undo the past. Perhaps this mission was his last attempt at redemption, if such a thing existed. Their pace was brisk. They stayed in a small column to deter bandits, but they avoided unnecessary confrontations. Even so, it took weeks to reach the Riverlands. The nights grew colder the farther north they rode. They slept beneath the stars or in half-ruined inns, wherever they could find shelter. Many times, they encountered peasants trudging south, hoping to flee the deepening cold. Jaime gave them what little coin he could spare, a gesture that felt both woefully inadequate and oddly fulfilling. Brienne rode near him most days, scanning the road for signs of trouble. Sometimes they spoke quietly about logistics, about the next settlement or the difficulty of forging a peace with the Starks. Sometimes they simply rode in silence, companionable in a way. Her presence reassured him, and he found that the memory of her unwavering moral compass lent him courage. The truce was a gamble, a dire gamble. But every day, as they traveled farther north, Jaime's conviction grew that it was the right one. They crossed the Trident at one of the broader fords, carefully navigating the cold water. The Riverlands had suffered deeply during the War of the Five Kings, and many villages lay abandoned. A hush seemed to fall over the land. Occasionally, they saw figures peering from behind shutters, but no one hailed them. Fear reigned here. Only the crows and the biting wind greeted them freely. Near Harrenhal's ruin, Jaime glimpsed the twisted towers against the bleak sky. Once the greatest castle in the realm, it was now an empty, cursed husk. He remembered spending nights there as a prisoner, remembered Qyburn's dark ministrations, and how that path had led him to more betrayals and regrets. Brienne rode up beside him, catching his haunted stare. "We shouldn't linger," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "There's too much darkness in that place." They pressed on. A day later, they encountered a ragged band of outlaws on the road. The confrontation was swift and brutal. A handful of starving, desperate men tried to ambush the column, brandishing rusty swords and clubs. Jaime's men formed a quick shield wall, and though the outlaws fought with the fury of hopelessness, they were quickly overpowered. A few were taken captive, their wounds tended by the group's single maester. Jaime had no wish to kill them, so they were spared and set free, disarmed and warned that if they returned, mercy might not be offered twice. The tension that followed the skirmish lingered in the campfires that night. Men worried that the next ambush might not be so easy. Winter was not even in full force yet, but the land was already in turmoil. At last, the wide expanse of the neck opened before them. Marshy ground stretched out under a moody sky. Clouds gathered overhead, threatening rain or snow. In the distance, the towers of Moat Cailin rose, battered by centuries yet still formidable. Jaime studied them, remembering how vital a choke point the fortress was. If the Starks wanted to bar the way north, this was the place to do it. As they drew closer, horns sounded from the walls. The banner Jaime raised was not strictly a white flag, but a simple cloth that denoted parley. He halted his men at a safe distance. A small party, including himself, Brienne, Ser Adam, and a few standard-bearers, advanced to speak. The gates remained shut. The walls bristled with archers, each arrow aimed squarely at them. Jaime kept his posture calm, forcibly ignoring the prickle of fear. He raised a hand in greeting, letting the archers see that he carried no drawn sword. A gruff voice called down, "Who approaches Moat Cailin?" Jaime made sure to speak loudly and clearly, letting each word carry. "Jaime Lannister, Lord Commander of the Kings." He stopped himself. He was no longer the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. That old title had been stripped from him in spirit, if not in official decree. "Jaime Lannister," he said again, "coming in peace to speak with Lord Stark. We seek parley." Silence from above, then a ripple of movement. The tension felt stretched tight as a bowstring. Finally, the same voice responded, "Wait here." A few figures disappeared from the battlements. Brienne shifted slightly in her saddle but said nothing. Jaime could almost sense her readiness if things turned sour. The minutes dragged on. One of the standard-bearers coughed nervously. The wind bit cold, and Jaime felt it seep into his bones, though he made no outward sign of discomfort. He had faced too many dangers, too many humiliations, to let a bit of cold unravel him. At last, the gates lumbered open enough to allow a small group of riders out. Leading them was a tall man with a thick gray beard, wearing the direwolf sigil upon his cloak. Jaime recognized him as Lord Roose Ryswell, a bannerman of the Starks. The man approached slowly, flanked by guards with drawn swords. Jaime's own retinue tensed, but he held up a hand. "Stay calm," he murmured. Ryswell halted a short distance away. "You claim you come in peace," he said. "The last time Lannisters came north under a banner of truce, there was treachery in the air. How do we know you're not here with a hidden force, intending to attack once inside our lands?" Jaime inclined his head, acknowledging the fear. "I cannot blame you for suspicion, my lord, but I have only 100 men, none of whom are eager for bloodshed. I have come because I believe the threat beyond the wall endangers us all. We Lannisters have fought the Starks enough times to know they are formidable foes. But perhaps, for once, we can be allies." Ryswell looked unimpressed, though he cast a glance at Brienne. "And you, my lady, Lady Brienne, I've heard of you. Do you vouch for this truce? For this man?" Brienne sat straighter, a flush creeping over her cheeks, but her voice was firm. "Ser Jaime and I have traveled far together. I believe his intentions are honorable in this matter. We seek an audience with Lord Stark, so that we might present terms of an alliance against the coming darkness." Ryswell stroked his beard. "That is for Lord Stark to decide. I will send a raven to Turfell. Until we receive a reply, you'll remain here under guard. Come inside the walls, if you wish, but know this. You try any trickery, you'll die before you see another sunrise." His eyes gleamed hard as flint. "I've waited a long time to see Lannister ambitions brought low." Jaime nodded. "Then let us wait. We have no illusions about the danger. Our men will camp quietly." So it was settled. The Lannister camp established itself just outside Moat Caelin's southern perimeter, given permission to draw water from a nearby spring but closely watched by northern sentries. The fortress itself housed only a small garrison, enough to hold the strategic point should any southern threat appear. Over the next 2 days, word went north via Raven. Jaime and Brienne waited, passing the time in conversation with the watchful northern soldiers, who had no shortage of stony glares for them. A few recognized Brienne from stories of her service to Lady Catelyn Stark, which helped somewhat. But Jaime sensed how precarious their situation was. A single rumor could ignite hostilities. On the evening of the second day, a new group arrived from the north. They galloped in, stirring up mud, carrying the Stark banner, a gray direwolf on a field of white. Jaime stood at the edge of the camp, waiting with Brienne. He felt his pulse quicken when he recognized the slight figure in the lead, cloaked in thick furs, Sansa Stark. He had not seen her in a long time, not since the days of King's Landing's intrigues. She was a woman grown now, though her hair was still that vivid Tully red. Her face bore a mixture of caution and dignity, the stark lines of experience etched around eyes that had once been full of innocence. She dismounted gracefully, ignoring the men around her. Her companions dismounted as well, soldiers in Stark livery, older knights from the Vale, and a tall young man with dark curls who hovered protectively near her. Jaime approached, bowing slightly, mindful of the watchers. He was keenly aware that his once proud Lannister name would buy him no courtesy here. "Lady Stark," he said in a measured tone. "It has been some time." Her eyes flicked over him, pausing on his golden hand. He could see the flicker of memory in them. She said, "Ser Jaime, I've come on behalf of my brother, Jon. He is king in the north, chosen by our people. He sent me to hear you out, to judge your intentions." Jaime nodded. "We welcome the chance to speak. We've come seeking peace, a truce, in fact. The war has cost us all dearly." Sansa's gaze swept over the men behind Jaime. "You say you come in peace. Why should the North trust a Lannister's oath?" He almost smiled. "Because, my lady, I have little else to offer but that oath. And because we share a greater enemy. I understand your brother has seen what lies beyond the wall firsthand. The White Walkers, the dead. I believe him. My family once chose to ignore such stories, but I cannot do so any longer. We do not have the luxury of doubt when winter descends." Sansa's composure was calm, though her eyes betrayed a flash of feeling. Fear, perhaps, or resolve. You speak of unity. Yet House Lannister inflicted suffering on my house, on the north. Robb Stark was betrayed and murdered at the Twins. My mother as well. The memories are still fresh. Jaime bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the truth. You have every reason to hate us, but hate will not save Westeros from the White Walkers. I come to you without subterfuge. All I ask is that you speak to your brother. Let him judge the sincerity of our offer. If we can unite our forces, then perhaps we stand a chance. Sansa finished, her voice dipping into a hush. She studied Jaime for a moment longer, then turned to Brienne. The lines of her face softened a fraction. Lady Brienne, I can't tell you how glad I am to see you. Brienne bowed her head humbly. My lady, it is good to see you safe. I pledged to your mother I would protect you and your sister, and I have tried to keep that vow in spirit. Ser Jaime and I journeyed here in hope that we could persuade the North of the need to stand as one. Sansa let out a long breath, then turned to the tall young man at her side. He inclined his head, a quiet gesture of respect, then murmured something in her ear. She nodded and turned back to Jaime. We will ride for Winterfell on the morrow, she said. If your men follow our column, we will escort you. There, we will discuss these matters with my brother, the king in the north. Jaime bowed formally. Thank you, my lady. They left it at that. The visitors retired to Moat Cailin, while Jaime's camp settled in for another cold night under northern skies. Snow drifted in the air, a gentle flurry that teased of greater storms. Jaime stood outside his tent, letting the snow melt on the steel of his golden hand, feeling the quiet hush of the north envelop him. He watched the flakes and remembered a time when snow was a novelty in King's Landing, an amusement for bored courtiers. Now it felt like a warning. He wondered if, in the end, any of them would survive the war to come. At dawn, they set out together. The Stark party rode at the head, with Sansa in front, her red hair a banner in the wind. The Lannister contingent followed, pressed in close by vigilant northern outriders. Jaime felt every eye on him. Now and then he glimpsed Sansa conferring with her companions, though her expression remained impassive. A lot had changed since she was a frightened girl betrothed to Joffrey. Life had hardened her, made her a leader in her own right. He could only hope that her sense of justice was tempered by practicality, for he feared that any push for vengeance would doom the alliance. The land grew colder as they advanced north. Snow piled on the roadside, and the trees wore icy shrouds. Food became scarcer. They trudged through patches of deep slush, the horses straining. Men huddled around fires at night, rationing their provisions. Everywhere Jaime looked, he saw the north preparing for a deep freeze. Farmhouses were boarded up, livestock driven south or butchered. People were scarce upon the roads, save for the occasional caravan heading south as fast as possible. One evening, they camped near a small frozen lake. The northern soldiers made a perimeter. Jaime set up his tent with Brienne and Ser Adam. While the men cooked a thin stew, Jaime ventured out, drawn by the quiet. He came upon Sansa Stark standing alone by the lake's edge, her fur cloak pulled tight. He hesitated, then approached softly, stopping at a respectful distance. The wind gusted over the ice. She glanced at him over her shoulder, wary. Ser Jaime. He inclined his head. My lady. Couldn't sleep. She turned back to the lake. Moonlight skimmed the ice, creating ghostly reflections. There's too much on my mind, she said. Jon trusts you more than you might realize. He told me of his conversation with your brother Tyrion across the sea. Tyrion said you could be reasoned with, that you were not blindly loyal to Cersei's ambitions. I see that might be true. Jaime exhaled a misty breath. I suppose I should be grateful to Tyrion. Yes, I've chosen a different path. I can't undo the past, Lady Stark, but I can do something for the future. She brushed a hand over her cloak, where a silver wolf's head was pinned. I have been cautious of alliances, especially with those who have hurt us. But I also know that every day we delay in forging unity is a day closer to destruction. by the White Walkers or by famine. Jon wrote that you have knowledge of the Lannister armory, that you can supply dragonglass from Dragonstone. Is that still possible? Jaime nodded. If we can coordinate with my brother, yes. He's in contact with Daenerys Targaryen, and they've begun mining dragonglass. The distribution is another matter, but if we have the North's cooperation, we could arm many soldiers with weapons that might harm the dead. That alone could change the course of the war. Sansa watched the ice shimmering under the moon, her face troubled yet determined. My brother has offered the Targaryen queen our support if she will help us defeat the White Walkers. If the Lannisters would stand beside us as well. She paused, gathering her thoughts. It seems impossible, doesn't it? Stark, Targaryen, Lannister. After all these years of hatred and war, sometimes the impossible is what must happen. Jaime looked down at the icy shoreline. I was once called Kingslayer for an impossible choice I made, to kill the king I was sworn to protect, because he would have burned the city alive. It haunted me, the scorn of it. But I would do it again to save the innocent. Now, with winter's threat, I realize we must set aside pride and do what must be done. Sansa closed her eyes briefly, a hint of weariness showing through her guarded demeanor. Then I hope your sincerity will move the other lords of the North, she said, because even if Jon commands them, many remember well the treachery done to House Stark. If they sense a trap, it will all fall apart. Jaime gave a grim half-smile. I expect no warm welcome, but we will not flinch. I only ask that we be allowed to prove ourselves. She nodded, her breath steaming in the cold. For a moment, they stood in silence, two survivors of wars that had changed them beyond measure. Then Sansa said softly, "Good night, Sir Jaime," and walked away. He stood there for a long while watching her retreating figure. He recalled the timid girl who once dreamed of knights and maidens, of golden-haired princes and songs of chivalry. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman of the North, steeled by hardship. He reflected that perhaps they were all shadows of who they used to be. The following days passed in a slow, cold march. The snows thickened, the winds cut sharper, and the men grew weary. But at last, the familiar sight of Winterfell's walls rose in the distance, perched upon the wintry plain. Jaime's heart pounded. This was the seat of House Stark, once overshadowed by Lannister might and wealth. Now, it felt like the realm's best hope, a bastion of resilience in the face of the coming storm. They approached the gates under the close escort of Stark men, and though the ramparts bristled with archers and watchers, the portcullis was raised upon Sansa's command. Winterfell's courtyard was bustling with activity. Men training with spears, stable hands rushing to and fro, supply wagons being unloaded. The sense of purpose was palpable. This was no idle castle. Word of the White Walkers had driven every inhabitant to prepare for siege. As Jaime's small column entered, the northern soldiers directed them to stable their horses and find lodging in a corner of the courtyard under guard. Tension hovered in the air like a storm cloud. Jaime dismounted, his breath plumed before him. He ran a hand over his tired horse's neck, murmuring calming words, then surrendered the reins to a stable boy who refused to meet his eyes. Around him, his men did likewise, many glancing warily at the ring of Stark soldiers that watched them. One misstep and swords would be drawn. Sansa Stark conferred with a steward, then approached Jaime and Brienne. "You'll be brought to the Great Hall shortly," she said. "Jon will be there, and the northern lords who are present. We will hear your proposal then." Jaime inclined his head. "Thank you, my lady." He cast a glance at Brienne. She gave a firm nod, and Jaime felt a flicker of gratitude for her steady presence. They were led inside the walls of Winterfell, guided through corridors warmed by hidden hot springs. Jaime felt the warmth radiating from the floors and walls, and it was a welcome relief from the icy gusts outside. Eventually, they came to the Great Hall, whose doors stood open, torchlight flickering beyond. Stepping inside, Jaime took in the sights. Row upon row of long tables, the banners of House Stark draped upon the stone walls, and a dais at the far end where the seat of the Lord of Winterfell awaited. Standing before that seat was a tall figure with dark hair, dressed in fur and leather, Longclaw at his side. Jon Snow, the king in the north. To his left stood a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, Tormund Giantsbane from beyond the wall, if Jaime recalled correctly. To the right stood Davos Seaworth, once in service to Stannis Baratheon. And around them, various northern lords and knights stood in uneasy formation. Jon's gaze locked onto Jaime the moment he entered. A hush fell over the hall. Jaime advanced slowly, Brienne at his side, flanked by Stark guards. He came to a stop a respectful distance from the dais and offered a short bow. "Your Grace," he said in a clear voice. Jon studied him, eyes dark and sober. "Ser Jaime Lannister." A murmur rippled through those gathered. Some scowled openly. Others watched with curiosity. Jaime took a measured breath. "I've come to propose a truce between House Lannister and House Stark. More than that, an alliance. The threats we face in the north overshadow all past enmity." Jon's face remained impassive. "An alliance with the house that destroyed half the realm, that put a bounty on my head, that beheaded my father, that orchestrated the slaughter of the Red Wedding? That's a heavy ask, Ser Jaime." The accusations stung, but Jaime accepted them. "I will not deny my family's sins," he said, "nor will I try to erase them with excuses. But I have seen enough of war, of destruction. You have seen the White Walkers. You know what they bring. My men and I are here at great personal risk, because we believe you speak the truth about the dead. If we don't unite, all of Westeros will be lost." Jon's gaze flicked to Brienne. "Lady Brienne, what do you say? You served my mother. You have protected my sisters. Do you believe the Lannisters truly come in peace?" Brienne stepped forward. Her voice was steady, resonating in the hall. "Your Grace, when I first met Ser Jaime, I thought him a vain, selfish man. Over time, I've seen him risk his life and his honor to uphold a promise. I believe that if he says he's come to help the North, he means it. Whatever House Lannister was in the past, Jaime Lannister stands here now of his own accord." Jon studied her for a long moment, and it seemed some of the tension in his shoulders eased. Then he turned his attention back to Jaime. "If what you say is true, if you sincerely offer your swords against the White Walkers, then the North can accept that help. But understand this. We will not suffer any betrayal or trickery. There is no margin for error. Once the army of the dead breaches the wall, there will be no second chances." Jaime nodded solemnly. "I understand, Your Grace. I have no interest in betrayal. House Stark and House Lannister have bled each other enough. This war that comes," he paused, glancing around the hall, "it's not a war we can win alone. If we stand together, perhaps we can survive." A rumble of low voices traveled among the northern lords. One older lord with a sour expression barked, "And what of Queen Cersei? Has she sanctioned this? Or is she planning to march south of our backs once winter has done its worst?" Jaime shook his head. "Cersei is consumed by her own battles. I'm not here on her behalf. I suspect she would prefer to let the rest of us die fighting the dead so she can swoop in later. I have parted ways with her. I do not speak for her. I speak only for the men who ride with me and any who see the sense in unity." The mention of Cersei stirred angry muttering, but Jon lifted a hand to quiet them. "Then this is not an alliance with House Lannister as a whole. It's an alliance with you, Ser Jaime, and the men under your command." "That is correct, Your Grace." Jon exchanged a glance with Sansa, who stood nearby, silent but watchful. She gave him a slight nod. Then he returned his focus to Jaime. "Very well. You and your men are welcome in Winterfell under guard. We'll treat you fairly, feed your men as we can, and we'll see what role you can play in the defense. Know that every move you make will be watched. Trust is not given lightly here." Jaime inclined his head. "We expect no less." "Thank you, Your Grace." A modicum of calm settled over the great hall as Jon gestured for them all to step aside for further discussion. Men parted to allow Jaime and Brienne forward onto the dais. Tormund Giantsbane eyed Jaime with open suspicion, while Davos Seaworth regarded him with thoughtful curiosity. Sansa took a place near Jon, and the swirl of lords closed in. They peppered Jaime with questions. About the Lannister forges, about possible shipments of dragonglass, about the number of men they could eventually muster if other Lannisters decided to follow Jaime's lead. Jaime answered as best he could, though he was acutely aware of how little he actually controlled. He explained that if Tyrion convinced Daenerys to lend her resources, and if the North was willing to open negotiations, then perhaps they could coordinate. It was a precarious chain of ifs, but the alternative was to do nothing and let the realm be overrun. They spoke late into the night. Torches burned low, and servants brought simple fare of bread and stew. Jaime tasted the North in that stew, a hearty warmth that belied the harsh land. Sitting at the long table with northern lords who had once been mortal enemies, Jaime wondered at how war had twisted them all. Men he had fought on the battlefield now listened to him speak of forging dragonglass weapons. Some still glared, but others seemed to be considering his words. The night was heavy with possibilities, and the knowledge that time was desperately short. When the meeting concluded, Jon announced that their guests would be shown to quarters within the keep. A guarded wing, to be sure, but still better than letting them freeze outside. As the lords and advisors dispersed, Jaime found himself standing near Jon and Sansa. A tension coiled in the silence between them. Sansa broke it. "We'll see how the realm reacts to news of a Stark Lannister ceasefire," she said quietly. "It may cause turmoil, but we have no choice." Jon nodded. "In the morning, we'll begin planning. We need to push more men to Eastwatch. The White Walkers could breach the wall at any time." He looked Jaime in the eye. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we begin preparing for war." Jaime nodded, the fatigue in his bones replaced by a grim determination. "Yes, Your Grace." He followed a steward to his chamber, a small stone room warmed by the subterranean hot springs. Brienne's chamber lay down the corridor, and he glimpsed her step inside, giving him a parting nod. He closed his own door, removed his armor piece by piece, and collapsed onto the simple bed, exhaustion washing over him. He stared at the ceiling for a long while, listening to the faint moan of wind through the arrow slits, pondering how surreal it was that he now lay within Winterfell, welcomed, if not quite accepted. Sleep came slowly, haunted by thoughts of the dead marching south, of Cersei's betrayal, of the uncertain alliance with the Starks. But Jaime Lannister did not regret his choice. The realm needed unity, and if he could help provide that, if he could right even a fraction of the wrongs wrought by his house, then so be it. Dawn came gray and cold, a familiar drizzle of snow drifting across the courtyard. Jaime rose, dressed, and ventured out into the swirl of Winterfell's routine. Soldiers drilled with wooden swords and pikes, blacksmiths hammered steel, stable boys tended the horses. Everywhere, there was a palpable sense of urgency. The king in the north had declared that they must all prepare for the worst winter in living Emery and a war beyond imagining. Jaime joined a gathering of officers in the Great Hall, where Jon and Sansa were laying out maps on a broad table. Brienne stood nearby, arms folded. Davos Seaworth pointed to a location on the map, a small castle near the coast. "If we can fortify this point with archers carrying dragonglass arrows, we might repel any whites that come from the sea. We don't know if they can or will, but best to be sure." Tormund grunted, looking bored with the details. "Where I come from, we just kill them with fire or run like hell if we can't." Jaime approached. Jon acknowledged his presence with a subtle tilt of the head. "Sir Jaime, we're planning the distribution of forces. We'll be sending ravens to gather as many men as we can. We need every able-bodied warrior. If your men have suggestions or expertise, now's the time." Jaime rested his golden hand on the edge of the table, scanning the map. "I've fought in many battles, but never against the dead. I'll rely on you to tell me their strengths and weaknesses. However, my men are disciplined with siege tactics and field formations. We can help train local levies who might lack experience. Also, I have some knowledge of how best to outfit men with heavy armor, though I wonder if weight matters when facing an enemy that doesn't tire." Jon nodded. "Train them in formation, in discipline. That will help. As for the White Walkers, we know dragonglass and Valyrian steel can kill them. Fire can destroy whites, but you need a lot of it, and you need to be careful not to burn yourselves in the process. His gaze lingered on the map. And we have rumors of ice spiders and undead giants. We'll plan for the worst. Sansa tapped a finger on the depiction of Winterfell. We have stores of grain and root vegetables, enough for a protracted siege, but not nearly enough for the sheer number of refugees heading our way. If we can't feed them, desperation will tear us apart from within. Jaime felt a tightness in his chest. The Crownlands are hardly in better shape, but if Tyrion can coordinate with Daenerys to ship supplies from regions less affected by the war, it might help. We'll need supply lines from the south. They continued in this vein for hours, mapping out the logistical nightmare of an entire kingdom on the brink of invasion by a supernatural force. Jaime was struck by how earnest Jon Snow was, serious, unpretentious, yet bearing the burden of leadership with quiet determination. He saw also how Sansa's keen mind for strategy complemented her brother's directness. Their synergy reminded Jaime uncomfortably of how he and Cersei once functioned, though it was a far healthier dynamic than the one he had shared with his twin. In the days that followed, Jaime and his men integrated themselves into Winterfell's routines. They patrolled the walls, helped train the recruits, and lent their expertise in forging weapons. Jaime oversaw the forging of new spearheads from dragonglass shards that the Northerners had begun stockpiling. Brienne spent hours each day drilling with the younger soldiers, her skill with a blade earning their cautious respect. Little by little, the presence of Lannister soldiers became a tolerable part of Winterfell's life, though there were still stares and muttered curses from those who had lost kin in the war. Amid these preparations, ravens arrived from Eastwatch, reporting sightings of the Night King's forces beyond the wall. The details were vague, but chilling. Rumors that the dead had grown in number, that whole villages in the far north had been overwhelmed. The final blow came a week later, when a raven from Castle Black arrived, stating that a massive host of the dead was gathering near the base of the wall, as if preparing for an assault. The halls of Winterfell buzzed with dread. The war was no longer a distant legend or rumor. It was upon them. Jon called another council. Jaime stood among the gathered lords and captains. Jon's expression was grim as he said, "The wall stands, but for how long? Bran has seen things." He glanced toward the shadows, where his youngest brother, now the quiet, uncanny three-eyed raven, sat with distant eyes. "We have to assume the wall can be breached. That means the dead will pour south in force. We must make our stand here." A shiver ran through the listeners. Tormund spat, "Best be ready to burn them all. I've killed enough whites to know it takes more than a blade of cheap steel." Jon nodded. "We have some dragonstone left, and more is on the way, but not nearly enough to arm everyone. We need to be strategic. Pikemen at the gates, archers with dragonglass arrowheads on the walls, reserves with torches and pitch." Sansa spoke up. "We should send out a warning to the local villages to evacuate to Winterfell immediately. We can't afford to lose any more farmers or blacksmiths. It'll put more strain on our stores," Davos cautioned. "We'll manage," Jon said. "Every pair of hands that can hold a weapon might matter." He glanced at Jaime. "Your thoughts, Ser Jaime?" Jaime rested one hand on the table, where a map of the north lay spread. "Winterfell is a strong fortress, well-positioned defensively. But if the enemy invests the castle entirely, we'll be surrounded. The question is whether we should attempt to meet them in the field first, try to whittle them down, or stay behind the walls." Jon exhaled. "Marching out might leave Winterfell vulnerable, but ceding the field entirely might let them encircle us. We'll have to consider the topography carefully." They argued possibilities, but the truth was sobering. The army of the dead was vast, tireless, and unstoppable without dragonglass or fire. Winterfell had strong walls and defenders, but this foe was unlike any normal army. There would be no negotiation, no retreat for the undead horde. Late that night, Jaime found Brienne in the courtyard, standing near the Old God's Wood entrance. Snow was falling heavily, drifting across her broad shoulders. He approached slowly, his breath pluming. "My lady," he greeted. She turned, a faint crease on her brow. "Sir Jaime, couldn't sleep again?" He gave a rueful shrug. "Hard to sleep when the apocalypse is at our doorstep." He glanced around the courtyard, quiet and still except for the patter of snow. "I never imagined I'd end up here in Winterfell, about to fight an army of the dead. All my life, the wars I fought were for crowns or kings, gold or glory. This is something else." She nodded. "It's strange, but perhaps it's the war we all truly deserve. The war to remind us what truly matters. The living against the dead." He studied her in the moonlight. "You've seen the worst of me, Brienne, yet you've stood by me in this. I wanted to thank you. Without you, I doubt I'd have the will to do what needs to be done." She looked away, her cheeks coloring. "I only do what is right. You made your choice. I only encouraged it." He remembered the day she'd leapt into the bare pit to defend him, the day he'd lost his hand, the mutual sacrifices they'd shared. Strange how war could forge bonds out of adversity. Jaime almost reached for her hand, then recalled that he had only one real hand left. Instead, he gave a slight nod, letting the silence speak for him. Then he cleared his throat. "We'll face them soon. Are you ready?" Her blue eyes flickered. "Ready or not, we'll fight. All my life, I've wanted to uphold oaths that meant something. I can think of no greater cause than defending the living from the dead." They stood there a moment more, the snow falling around them in quiet testament to the North's unrelenting cold. Jaime felt a surge of resolve. This was worth fighting for, even dying for, if it came to that. A realm where people like Brienne could stand for justice, where the petty games of lords and ladies were overshadowed by the simple desire to survive. Perhaps that was the only thing that could unite them now. In the days that followed, the call to arms echoed throughout the North. Houses once hesitant began streaming into Winterfell. The Karstarks, the Mormonts, the Glovers. Others too. Some arrived with only a few dozen men, others with 100. Food grew short, but morale seemed bolstered by the sense of common purpose. Jaime oversaw daily training drills in the courtyard, ensuring men at least knew the basics of fighting whites. He hammered home the importance of aiming for the neck or legs to dismember them quickly, or to use dragonglass-laden weapons. The Lannister soldiers under his command worked side by side with the Northerners, forging an uneasy but evolving sense of camaraderie. You could see it in the way they shared laughs after an exhausting drill or traded tips on best how to keep warm in the bitter nights. As the final snows of that week began to blanket the fields around Winterfell in a deep, unbroken white, word came from the wall. The Night King had made his move. A section of the wall near Eastwatch had been brought down, some said by a dragon of ice and blue flame, though accounts were confusing and fragmentary. Many of the watch had fled or were killed. The army of the dead was marching south at last. The news spread through Winterfell like wildfire, chilling hearts more than the northern winds ever could. No more illusions. The war was here. Jon called everyone to the battlements. Torches burned in sconces along the walls, illuminating the swirling snow. Jaime stood on the parapet, Brienne to his left, his men around him, looking out over the plains. A distant thunder seemed to rumble in the dark sky, as if the earth itself trembled under the weight of the approaching horde. Looking down, he saw hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers gathered inside the gates, ready to defend. The sky had a sickly, slate-gray cast, the sun hidden by looming clouds. The air felt charged, pregnant with dread. Jon's voice rose above the wind, calling across the battlements. "Men and women of the North, knights and soldiers of the South who have come to aid us, we stand on the brink of the greatest battle of our time. The dead do not stop. They feel no fear, no pain. But we have each other and we have weapons that can kill them. Hold your lines, trust the man or woman beside you. Remember, the only way we win is by standing together." A ragged cheer rose, but it was laced with fear. Jaime could sense it. He felt it in himself, an anxious coil in his gut. He had been in countless battles, but never one like this. He gripped the hilt of his sword, the Valyrian steel blade that had once belonged to House Tarly. He glanced at Brienne, who carried Oathkeeper, its ancient steel ready to meet the undead. Two halves of the same ancestral sword, reforged in Lannister halls. Now they would fight side by side to protect the very house that once was their enemy. Fate indeed had a sense of irony. Within hours, they began to see shapes on the horizon. Dark silhouettes that gradually resolved into a massive movement, a restless sea of bodies. The army of the dead. They advanced without banners, without cries, the only sound the eerie moan of the wind. Scouts returned breathless, reporting the presence of whites and white walkers, and something else. A monstrous shape in the sky, glimpsed through the clouds. The Night King, riding a horror of undead dragonflesh, or so the whispers said. The horns sounded from Winterfell's walls, echoing across the snowy wastes. Jaime took his position near the main gate, leading a battalion of men with dragonglass-tipped spears. Brienne stood off to the flank with the cavalry, ready to reinforce any breach. Jon and Tormund took the center, Davos overseeing the archers on the walls. Sansa, protected by a guard, watched from a higher tower, coordinating the evacuation of non-combatants to the crypts below. Torches flared, and a volley of flaming arrows cut across the sky. In moments, the first wave of undead slammed into the outer defenses, makeshift trenches, sharpened stakes, and patches of oil-soaked ground. Fire erupted, casting an orange glow upon the pale, rotting faces of the whites. They screeched and pressed forward, oblivious to the flames that licked at their limbs. The living braced shields and spears. Metal rang, voices shouted, and the clash of battle commenced. Jaime felt his heart hammer as the whites surged like a tide. He steadied a young soldier beside him. "Hold the line," he bellowed. The spears thrust forward, skewering the undead. The dragonglass burned cold against their corrupted flesh, and the whites collapsed into unmoving heaps. But more came, climbing over their fallen to claw at the living. Men screamed as skeletal hands dragged them from behind the shield wall. Jaime's sword flashed, Valyrian steel cleaving through dead flesh. He grimaced as the stench hit him, a mix of decay and cold earth. The wave broke upon them, receded, and then came again. Torches flared, black pitch ignited, and shrieking whites burned. But still they advanced. Arrows from the walls whistled down, many tipped with dragonglass, felling dozens. Yet it was never enough. Each moment, more of the dead poured in from the darkness. Overhead, a roar shattered the night. Jaime looked up to see a vast silhouette streaking across the sky. One of Daenerys's dragons, perhaps. Flames burst somewhere in the distance, lighting up the field. A second roar answered, hollow and piercing, the cry of something monstrous that belonged in nightmares. The undead dragon. A moment later, a lance of unnatural blue flame cut across the dark heavens, and Jaime's stomach clenched at the sight. Gods, let the living dragon triumph. He prayed silently, though he had never been a pious man. In the confusion, the lines nearly buckled. Jaime shouted orders, rallying men to reform the shield wall. He plunged back into the thick of the fight, ignoring the biting cold, the numbing fear. Time blurred into a frenzy of desperate combat. The ground grew slick with gore, the screams and groans forming a symphony of horror. Somewhere to his left, a white leapt upon a Lannister soldier, tearing at his throat. Jaime slashed it down, but the soldier was already lost. The man's eyes met Jaime's for a fleeting moment, filled with despair, before he collapsed. Then the horns sounded again, 3 long blasts from the battlements. Jaime risked a glance over his shoulder and saw that the outer defenses had been partially breached near the left flank. The undead were pouring in behind the lines. Fear stabbed at him, but he had no choice but to keep fighting. He prayed Brienne was there, plugging the gap with the cavalry. Her oath to protect the living would not let her waver. He felt a surge of terror like never before. The old wars had been bloody, but at least the men they faced could be reasoned with, bribed or broken. The dead had no such vulnerabilities. They merely marched and killed. "Fall back to the second barricade," came a shout from somewhere behind the lines. "Regroup." Jaime ordered his men to withdraw methodically, forming a rear guard. They retreated toward Winterfell's gate, stumbling through mud and blood, trying to maintain discipline. Each step felt like it cost a life. Whites fell upon anyone who moved too slowly, dragging them down in a shriek of agony. The archers on the walls kept up a steady rain of flaming arrows, but the swarming dead pressed forward relentlessly. At the gate, Jaime finally saw Brienne, her white cloak smeared with ash and blood. She was swinging Oathkeeper in broad arcs, carving a path through the whites. Around her, the cavalry struggled to wheel their horses in the congested space. When Jaime caught her eye, he saw relief but also raw determination. "We can't hold them out here much longer," she shouted above the din. He looked around, the bitter truth plain. The outer courtyard was lost. "We'll fall back inside the walls. Seal the gates." Jon's orders carried over the chaos. Men poured back through the gate, forming a last line of defense within Winterfell's inner yard. Massive beams groaned as they were hauled to brace the entrance. Moments later, the gates slammed shut. Through the gaps in the ramparts, Jaime could see the whites battering at the walls, surging like a storm-driven tide. The very gates shuddered under their assault. He turned and caught sight of Sansa on the walkway above, her face pale, watching the nightmare unfold. "Get to the crypts!" someone cried, beckoning the non-combatants. But Sansa refused to leave, not yet. Jon was somewhere else in the fray, perhaps on the ramparts or trying to coordinate a defense. Jaime stumbled across the yard, helping a wounded soldier find a place against the wall. The man coughed, blood bubbling at his lips, but Jaime had no time to linger. Others needed him. He and Brienne rallied the defenders to form a shield line in front of the gate, waiting for the inevitable breach. The pounding on the gate intensified. Wood splintered. The men stood, shaking, knuckles white on their weapons. Brienne lifted her sword, expression unwavering, and shouted, "Hold! Hold your ground!" The gate burst open. The night and its horrors poured into the yard. And so the battle for Winterfell truly began. The gate burst like rotten wood under the dead's relentless onslaught, sending jagged shards and splinters wheeling through the air. In they came, a tide of rotted faces and clawing limbs, pushing past the ruined barricade in a howling press. Jaime Lannister, already battered and exhausted, forced the horror from his mind and raised his sword. This was the moment they had worked toward for weeks, the stand they had prepared for. Half a heartbeat passed, a sharp pull of breath. Then he lunged forward with the rest of the line, colliding with the dead in a tumult of shrieks and clashing steel. The whites pressed against the shield wall with an unholy strength. Some were little more than skeletons in ragged leathers, others fresh corpses. Their eyes glazed but their jaws slack with dreadful hunger. Dragonglass-tipped spears struck out, splintering bone or rending putrid flesh. Whenever the black rock pierced their unnatural forms, a strange hiss of power ran through them, and they dropped in spasms to the churned-up snow. But for each one cut down, two more took its place. "Hold!" Brienne's voice echoed across the yard. Jaime caught sight of her out of the corner of his eye, her hair plastered to her forehead by sweat and melting snow, Oathkeeper stained dark with the ichor of the undead. She was a solid pillar of will and skill, commanding the men around her to keep the line intact. Some found courage by following her example. Others panicked, stumbling back, only for her to yank them forward again with a ferocity that brooked no argument. Jaime parried a wild slash from a white that still clutched a rusted sword in its half-decayed hand. His Valyrian blade sheared the creature's arm clean off, sending it tumbling to the trampled snow. The corpse staggered once, then resumed its assault with the other hand, raking yellowed nails across Jaime's breastplate. He twisted away, golden hand raised to block. He hammered the white skull with a swift punch. Then, pivoting, he finished it with a driving stab to the chest, letting the dragonglass embedded in the blade's steel do its grim work. The white collapsed in a tangle of limbs. No time to dwell on the kill. Another white lunged, and he repeated the lethal dance again and again, arms aching, breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him, men fell, sometimes only yards away, screams swallowed by the night. The courtyard was a frenzy of chaos. Torchlight flickering wildly, black shadows dancing, shrieks and howls of the dying and the dead. Snow. Whirled overhead, and in the darkness, roaring flames or spitting blue fire erupted whenever a dragon overhead passed close enough to unleash destruction. Jaime glimpsed the top of the walls, where archers were forced to abandon their bows and engage wights that had climbed the ramparts. He saw Tormund up on the battlements, his bright hair visible through the gloom, brandishing an axe and howling as if to show the dead what true ferocity was. The stout beams bracing the gate were splintered now, letting in more of the undead through every gap. Bodies stacked up, human and white alike. Yet the army of the dead seemed endless. "Fall back to the inner keep," a voice roared. It sounded like Jon Snow, though Jaime couldn't pick him out in the crush. The plan was to cede the yard if it became overrun, drawing the fight deeper into Winterfell's labyrinth of corridors and walls, layered defenses that might buy them time. It was not an ideal tactic, but in the face of such overwhelming numbers, retreat step by step had been the only strategy. Each ring of defense was designed to slow the dead, to funnel them into narrower killing fields. But the cost was blood, and so much of it. Brienne was already directing men to pull back. They moved in a wedge formation, trying to keep from being surrounded. Jaime ran with them, calling orders, slicing down another wight that lunged at his flank. The sky overhead thundered, or perhaps it was the dragons. Impossible to tell. By the time Jaime and the others reached the second gate that led deeper into the castle, sweat mingled with melted snow under his helm. He coughed and spat, tasting ash. Some men rushed to bar the new gate. The rest pivoted and reformed ranks. Wights soon clawed at the other side, their pale hands reaching through iron bars, snapping, eyes glowing with that eerie blue fire. For a moment, the living had a respite, a few precious seconds to breathe. Jaime looked around, trying to take stock. Brienne was here, breathing heavily, sword dripping. Ser Adam Richards, the gray-haired Lannister officer who had pledged to follow Jaime north, leaned on a shattered spear, his face gaunt. A handful of battered men stood in a circle, panting. There had been far more of them an hour ago. Beyond the newly barred gate, the courtyard was a mass of writhing forms. The wights hammered themselves against the iron, heedless of the fact that their bodies would break before the metal gave way. "They'll breach eventually," Brienne said between breaths. She wiped blood from her cheek with the back of a gauntlet. "We can't hold them out forever. Where is Jon?" Jaime scanned the swirl of men and women in the cramped space. "He was on the walls," he said, shaking his head. "We'd best assume he's still alive. The man's too stubborn to die. We hold our position and wait for word. If the White Walkers come, we stand or we fall together." As if on cue, the night around them echoed with a haunting cry, like frozen metal scraping across stone. Instinctively, Jaime knew that was the sound of a White Walker. They had glimpsed them only rarely so far, tall, gaunt figures with flesh like pale ice, armed with weapons that radiated cold. Whites were terrifying enough. The Walkers were worse, for their presence seemed to sap the will of men. And they commanded the Whites, leading the dead forward with an uncanny intelligence. The gate shuddered violently. Jaime heard metal groan. Some wight on the other side had begun slamming its rotting body into the iron, perhaps stacked upon others. "Brace it!" he shouted. A handful of men rushed forward, pressing their shoulders to the gate, trying to hold it. The rhythmic pounding intensified, a mindless drumbeat of bodies crashing. The squeal of steel told them the gate would not hold for long. "Pull back again," Brienne said, urgency spiking her voice. "We'll fight them in the passages." Before anyone could move, the hinges buckled. The iron gate blew inwards, flinging some defenders to the ground. Bodies tumbled over them, wights in a sickening avalanche. Screams erupted. Jaime staggered back, raising his sword, swinging desperately as the dead scrambled to their feet and lunged for living flesh. Another wave spilled in, unstoppable. Chaos reigned. Jaime narrowly avoided a slashing claw at his face, punching the wight with his golden hand. He felt bones crunch under the force of that blow. Then he cut horizontally with his sword, severing half the Wight's torso, sending it toppling. Another lunged from the side, and he whirled to meet it, the flickering torchlight casting strange shadows across rotted features. His blade cut deep, but not quickly enough to save a nearby soldier who was tackled and torn open in a spray of crimson. Jaime saw the man's eyes grow wide in horror. He was only a boy, perhaps 17. All the Lannister knight could do was finish the Wight a second later, far too late. Brienne let out a guttural shout as she rallied a cluster of men to create a wedge that might allow them to retreat down the corridor. Step by step, they gave ground, hacking and stabbing. The corridor walls were lined with flickering torches, some of which had been doused in the struggle. The gloom made it harder to see, easier for the dead to lunge out of the darkness. The smell of rot and blood was suffocating. Farther within, the corridor branched. A steward's voice echoed down the hall. "Lady Sansa, this way." Jaime spotted Sansa for an instant, flanked by a pair of guards, but she vanished around a corner, presumably heading toward the deeper keep or the crypts. Good, he thought. If the Lady of Winterfell were to fall, morale would crumble. But it also meant they could not allow the dead to breach too far inside, or there would be no safe place for civilians. Everything slowed into a haze of raw survival. Jaime lost track of time. He fought Wight after Wight in the corridor. More defenders streamed past him, bloodied and frantic, some taking up new positions to hold choke points. Others fell back in disarray. The clang of steel, the wet crunch of flesh being rent, the screams, the cursing, the moans. It melded into a single, unending roar. Once or twice he felt the White Walker's presence but did not see them, only a blast of chill air that made frost gather on the stones. The Whites surged with renewed vigor wherever that invisible influence passed. At some point, Jaime became separated from Brienne. He caught a final glimpse of her back as she charged down a side passage, leading a group that aimed to block a new breach. He almost called her name, but a new threat demanded his attention. Two Wights lunging from his left, rotted fangs bared. He shoved the first aside, impaling the second. The moment he pulled his blade free, the Wight behind him sprang up, jaws snapping. Jaime cursed and drove his golden hand into its skull with all his strength, smashing it to the ground. A spear jabbed from behind him. Ser Adam, panting with exertion, finishing the creature off with a dragonglass point. "You're still alive," Jaime rasped, nodding thanks. Ser Adam just nodded, face pale. They withdrew down the corridor together, trying to rejoin the rest. By the time they emerged into a secondary hall that led to the Great Keep, they found a group of ragged soldiers forming a shield wall in front of a massive set of doors. Jaime recognized the sigils on their surcoats. House Mormont, House Glover, a scattering of Stark men. They were bracing for another wave. The air itself seemed colder, and the frosty breath of the living hung in thick clouds. Jaime took up a position next to them, sword at the ready. An ominous silence fell, punctuated only by the moan of wind through the corridors. Then came the scrape of something against stone. From the darkness emerged a White Walker, tall and graceful in its ghastly manner, with skin like ice and eyes of crystalline blue. It wore armor that glimmered with rime, and in its hand it held a wicked-looking sword that dripped cold mist. Behind it lurched a press of Wights, waiting for their master's command. The defenders shivered, the intangible aura of the Walker's presence sapping their courage. Jaime's heart hammered. He had faced one White Walker before, and that had been enough to leave a deep impression. But he had a Valyrian steel sword. He knew it could kill them. The Walker tilted its head, as if studying the living. Then it attacked, gliding forward with supernatural speed. The men in the shield wall braced, but the Walker's sword crashed into the shields and shattered them with a noise like crackling ice. A second blow froze the breath in Jaime's lungs. The Mormont soldier next to him collapsed, screaming, as the freezing sword cleaved through his chainmail as though it were paper. Jaime lunged, trying to strike from the flank, but the Walker whirled and met his blade in a clash of shrieking metal. Valyrian steel ground against ice-forged steel, sparks and frost flying. Jaime's arm shook violently. He almost lost his grip on the hilt. The walker hissed, a hateful sound that sent shards of ice scattering from its mouth. Jaime gritted his teeth, shifting his stance, and pushed. For a heartbeat, they were locked, each straining. Then the walker disengaged with an unnatural twist of its arm, stepping back so quickly it seemed to flicker. Jaime knew better than to let it gain momentum. He roared and charged, swinging the sword in a deadly arc aimed at the walker's torso. With inhuman grace, it ducked, the blow singing against the stone wall, sparks dancing. Jaime recovered instantly and thrust. This time, his blade caught the walker in the shoulder, Valyrian steel biting deep. The creature let out an unearthly shriek, and cracks of ice spread across its flesh. It staggered, turning impossibly bright blue eyes on Jaime. But before he could finish it off, a wave of whites swarmed between them, forcing Jaime to back away. He slashed at them, but the brief opening to kill the walker was lost. When the whites parted again, the walker was gone, retreated into the gloom. Its lesser minions came in a flood now, no longer held back, eager to tear apart any living they could find. Jaime and the defenders fought for every inch of ground. His arms burned, and though he was coated in sweat, the chill remained. Bodies piled up, both living and dead. The corridor leading to the great keep turned into a charnel house. Ser Adam was there, spitting blood from a gash on his lip, but still standing. A Mormont soldier tried to wrestle a white off a wounded comrade only to be overwhelmed himself. Another was cornered against the wall until Jaime cut down the attackers with a flurry of desperate sword blows. The fighting raged on. Gradually, they were driven closer to the great hall. The heavy doors were open, letting them retreat inside. Jaime heard Sansa's voice from within, shouting orders to gather the wounded deeper in the keep. He heard the ring of steel from multiple passages. This was a battle on all fronts, the old stone echoing with the cries of men and undead alike. Yet Winterfell still stood. The living refused to surrender. A burst of fire lit the sky outside, glimpsed through an arrow slit. Jaime risked a glance. He saw a dragon's shape swoop low, torching the hordes in the outer yard. Flames lapped at the night sky. The ground shook under a thunderous impact. Another dragon? Possibly the undead beast. Distant roars reverberated, and for an instant, the entire world felt precarious, as though the sky itself might collapse. Inside, a northern officer yelled, gesturing frantically. Close the doors. With no other choice, Jaime and the remaining defenders stumbled into the great hall, dragging the wounded. Ser Adam and two others slammed the doors behind them, bracing them with whatever furniture they could find. Tall candelabras, benches, and a heavy table were heaped against the entrance. Inside, the great hall had been turned into a command center, a makeshift infirmary, and a last bastion all at once. Dozens of wounded lay along the walls, moaning or silent with shock. Runners darted about, distributing water and bandages. A few huddled non-combatants, old men, women, children, clutched each other in terror. Sansa Stark stood near the dais, calm but pale, her cloak flecked with blood. Davos Seaworth was there as well, his face grim as he helped the soldier to a seat, then turned to Jaime. "How bad is it out there?" Davos asked, voice low. Jaime sucked in a breath, trying to steady his nerves. "They've taken the outer yard and forced us back through the second gate. The walls are overrun. We fought a White Walker just outside. We wounded it, but it got away. The dead keep coming." He looked around. "Has Jon Snow returned?" Davos shook his head. "Last I heard, he was on the battlements or maybe in the Godswood. There are reports of White Walkers converging there. Something about the Night King wanting the boy, Bran." His voice caught. "I can't keep track. The entire castle's a battlefield." Sansa's eyes flicked up at mention of Bran. "He's in the Godswood. We placed guards there," she said, a tremor betraying her worry. "He insisted on using himself as bait, or so he told Jon. Some business of the three-eyed raven. I don't fully understand, but he believes the Night King will come for him." Jaime's mind spun with images of the ancient weirwood in the Godswood, the red leaves, the face carved in white bark. The boy who was no longer truly a boy, but a strange, distant seer. If that was the Night King's target, he might soon appear in person. Jaime swallowed. Then Jon is likely there, trying to defend him. Ser Adam approached, exhausted. Ser Jaime, we can barricade ourselves in here, but if the dead breach the Great Hall, it's over. We can't hold them off in this enclosed space for long. Jaime glanced at Sansa. You should join the others in the crypt, my lady. This is no place for you. She stood rigid, chin lifted. I won't hide while my people fight and die, but I will do what is needed if the hall is lost. She turned to Davos. Can we send more men to reinforce the Godswood? If the Night King is truly heading there, perhaps we can trap him. If he falls, maybe the rest of the dead will too. Davos winced. We barely have men left uninjured. Still, you're right. We must try. If the Night King dies, the Whites might collapse. That's what Jon believes. Jaime exhaled. The memory of that fateful White hunt beyond the wall and the knowledge that slaying the White Walker who had raised them often destroyed the Whites under its control came back to him. The Night King was the source of them all, in some sense. If he fell... Let's gather who we can, Jaime said. We'll make a push to the Godswood. If we fail, at least we tried. Sansa glanced around. Very well. We'll hold here as long as we can. Any who can still wield a blade, go with Ser Jaime. The rest... She paused, swallowing. The rest will fight to keep the doors sealed. Or, if that fails, retreat to the crypt. Jaime nodded, grateful for her composure. Then he turned to address the battered men in the hall. Listen up. We'll form a strike group. Anyone who can still stand, gather at the side entrance. We'll attempt to reach the Godswood, link up with the king in the north, and protect Bran Stark. Or die trying. A murmur rippled through the survivors. Some nursed injuries that prevented them from joining, but others, knights, Sellswords, Lannisters, Northerners, stepped forward. Brienne was nowhere to be seen, which worried Jaime. But perhaps she was already fighting in the Godswood or had fallen to the undead. He refused to let that thought linger. He had to focus on this final gamble. Within minutes, a motley group of about 30 fighters assembled, each clutching dragonglass weapons or battered swords. They were bruised, bleeding, eyes rimmed with fatigue, but resolute in the knowledge that everything depended on them. Davos volunteered as well, sliding a short dragonglass dagger into his belt. I'm no great knight, he said quietly, but I'll stand with you. Jaime only nodded, appreciating the man's unwavering sense of duty. They filed toward the side exit of the Great Hall, prying open a small postern door that led into a dim corridor. Outside, the corridors still crawled with Whites, but perhaps the main mass was now pressing the front gates and the yard. If they moved swiftly and avoided large knots of the dead, they might reach the Godswood. The moment they set foot into the corridor, the stench of decay and spilled blood assaulted them anew. Low torchlight revealed the aftermath of brutal fighting. Corpses strewn on the floor, some half-burned. Jaime stepped around them, sword at the ready. The corridor opened onto another courtyard, smaller and separated from the main yard, coated in fresh snow and churned earth. Bodies were scattered here too, but no Whites were visible at first glance. Stay alert, Jaime hissed. The group moved out, forming a rough circle around the perimeter. A wind gust swept through, chilling them. Overhead, the faint glow of distant fires lit the sky. Shouts echoed from far walls, and the thunder of dragons resounded. They had just begun to cross the yard when the snow erupted in front of them, a White rising from beneath the drift. An old corpse coated in frost. It snarled, flailing at the nearest fighter. Half a dozen more stirred nearby, half buried in the drifts. Immediately, the group sprang into action, hacking and stabbing. The Whites, disoriented from having been dormant or forced down by earlier fighting, were quickly dispatched. Jaime finished one with a swift dragonglass thrust, feeling his heart pound at the ambush. Even the ground could be a trap now. Moving on, they found a narrow passage that led around the castle's main keep toward the Godswood. There, large gnarled trees soared overhead, though from this vantage, They could only see the tops of branches rising behind walls. The passage was claustrophobic, wide enough for only 3 or 4 men abreast. Jaime positioned himself at the head, along with Davos and 2 northern spearmen. Every echo of footstep and every gust of wind made them tense for another ambush. Suddenly, from behind a low wall of rubble, more wights scrambled out. They had once been castle servants or perhaps small folk refugees, twisted forms with limbs bent at unnatural angles. Jaime cursed, raising his blade. The corridor filled with the clamor of steel on bone. One of the spearmen thrust at a wight's chest but missed. The creature locked teeth on his arm, dragging him down. Jaime slammed his golden hand into its skull and drove his sword through its spine. Davos stepped in, finishing off another wight with a wild slash that opened its neck. They advanced relentlessly, feet slipping in slush that quickly turned red. A few more paces, a few more kills. At last, the passage opened into the Godswood, a place that had once been serene, with ancient trees and a small pool at its center. Now it was a battleground of ice and shadow. Flickering torchlight revealed a ring of defenders near the heart of the grove, including some of the Night's Watch, wildlings, and Stark soldiers. They formed a circle around Bran Stark, who sat beneath the weirwood, eyes rolled back in a trance. Jaime felt a jolt of relief to see that Brienne was among them, though battered and bloodied. Jon Snow was there too, clutching Longclaw, hair matted to his brow, posture tense. They were surrounded by an encroaching legion of wights, and among them strode tall silhouettes that could only be White Walkers, their ice blades glinting in the dim light. It looked as though the defenders were on the brink of being overwhelmed. Jaime wasted no time. "Charge!" he roared to the fighters behind him. They rushed in, smashing into the flank of the undead. The wights recoiled momentarily, giving the embattled defenders inside the circle a second's respite. The ring parted just enough for Jaime's group to merge with them. Jon's head snapped up at Jaime's arrival, eyes flicking with surprise and relief. "Good timing," Jon panted. "We're nearly done in." "Where's the Night King?" Jaime asked, scanning the gloom. He saw no sign of the dark figure astride an undead dragon, but the presence of White Walkers told him the being must be close. Jon turned his head upward. "He was in the sky moments ago. That monster Viserion," he grimaced. "We've heard roars, the blasts of that blue flame. Daenerys is in the air with Rhaegal trying to fight him. But the Night King might come for Bran at any moment. If we can't kill him, this is all for naught." Lightning flickered overhead, or perhaps it was the glare of dragonfire. A powerful wind buffeted the Godswood, tossing branches to and fro. The wights pressed their advantage. White Walkers glided closer, their eyes glowing with malignant purpose. Brienne emerged from the ring of defenders, chest heaving. She looked Jaime in the eye with desperate relief, then turned her attention back to the White Walkers. "There are 3 of them," she said. "They've been picking us off with freezing swords. Jon managed to kill one, but we're barely hanging on." Jaime scanned the circle. Among the living was Tormund Giantsbane, bleeding from a gash in his scalp, and a few wildlings. Ghost, Jon's direwolf, paced among them, muzzle streaked with black blood. Samwell Tarly stood behind a tree, trembling but holding a dragonglass dagger. Mira Reed was there too, kneeling by Bran, her face pale. The rest were a hodgepodge of men on their last legs. They needed help, and quickly. He wiped sweat from his brow, stepping closer to Jon. "Then let's even the odds. You take 1 walker, I'll take another. We coordinate with Brienne or Tormund for the 3rd. Jon met his gaze. "We might not get a second chance." "I know." Jaime lifted his sword, Valyrian steel flashing in the half-light. "For the realm, for the living." Jon managed a thin smile. "For the living." At that moment, the White Walkers struck. One raised its icy spear and hurled it with supernatural speed, aiming for Bran. Brienne leapt to intercept, batting the spear aside with Oathkeeper. The clash sent an explosion of frost shards across the clearing. Another walker darted forward, sword trailing a haze of icy mist. Jon moved to intercept, but half a dozen whites converged on him at once, forcing him to fend them off in a desperate flurry of parries. Jaime sprinted toward the second walker, trusting that Brienne or Tormund would handle the third. As he neared, the temperature plummeted, crystals forming on his sword's hilt. The walker swung at him, an elegant sweep that stung Jaime's arms with the cold that radiated from it. He met the blow with all his strength, Valyrian steel colliding with ice. Sparks of frosty light cascaded as the blades locked. Gritting his teeth, Jaime fought with a combination of deft footwork and raw determination. He might not have been the swordsman he was before losing his hand, but necessity made him sharper. He used the momentum of each parry, shifting his weight to strike swiftly from unexpected angles. The walker moved like a dancer, effortless, a silhouette of malice in the gloom. Each time Jaime's sword nearly connected, the walker twisted away. A white lunged at Jaime's back, forcing him to spin away from the walker to dispatch it. That gave the walker time to swing again. Jaime barely got his blade up in defense. The impact sent a jolt up his arm, and he stumbled, losing his footing on the icy ground. He crashed down onto one knee, golden hand scraping the frozen earth. The walker advanced, raising its sword for a killing blow. Then, out of nowhere, a shape barreled into the walker. A mass of red hair and brute force, Tormund. The wildling slammed into the creature's side with his axe raised. The walker twisted, parrying Tormund's strike, but the delay gave Jaime time to scramble upright. Side by side, man and wildling attacked. Tormund roared like a bear, smashing the walker's defense with raw power. Jaime aimed a precise thrust at its torso, the very tip of his Valyrian blade punching through the otherworldly armor. The walker shrieked, that same harrowing cry of ice fracturing. Cracks spread from the impact. Jaime pressed in, driving the blade deeper until the hilt struck. With a final piercing wail, the walker exploded into shards of ice, collapsing into drifting crystals. The fragments settled on the snow, lifeless. Tormund spat, wiping frost from his beard. "You fight good for a southerner," he grunted, though a grin flickered in his eyes. Jaime nodded, heart hammering. Before he could speak, another shriek from across the clearing made them turn. Brienne was locked in combat with the third White Walker, Oathkeeper slashing arcs of shimmering steel. She fought valiantly, but the Walker's strength was monstrous. Brienne staggered under a powerful blow that forced Oathkeeper down, and the Walker's blade snapped in from above. She just managed to lean away, but the tip carved a shining line across her armor, leaving frost behind. No time to lose. Jaime and Tormund sprinted toward her. The whites around the clearing, momentarily stunned by the destruction of one of their masters, were regrouping, but not fast enough to stop them. Brienne managed to parry the next blow, but her footing slipped, and the walker hammered her shield, nearly tearing it from her arm. She fell to one knee. Jaime roared, lunging in. He swung high, forcing the walker to disengage from Brienne and pivot to defend. Tormund came from the side, hooking his axe at the walker's leg. The synergy of the assault forced the walker back a step. Brienne regained her footing and drove Oathkeeper up in a swift arc. For an instant, the walker was off balance, arms extended, vulnerable. She seized that chance. Oathkeeper, reforged from Ned Stark's ancestral Valyrian steel, pierced the walker's center. The monster let out a despairing howl. The pale ice of its features cracked, and then it shattered into nothing, swirling in a glittering mist. Brienne panted, sinking onto one knee, battered but victorious. All around them, the whites stumbled as if disoriented. Some collapsed outright, their animating force severed. Others continued blindly, still driven by some deeper link, perhaps to the Night King himself. Jaime saw Jon across the grove, slicing down a final white with long claw. Nearby, a half-dozen defenders struggled with the last stragglers. Ghost lunged at a pair of them, tearing them apart. Then, in the lull, all eyes turned to the center of the Godswood. Bran Stark still sat beneath the weirwood, his blank gaze fixed on something none of them could see. The pale bark behind him was streaked with red sap, giving the carved face a crimson tear. The wind rattled the branches overhead. For a moment, silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of survivors. Jaime took stock of who remained. Brienne, Tormund, Jon, Sam, Davos, a handful of watchers in black, and half a dozen wildlings or northerners. Most were wounded or near collapse. But for now, the immediate threat in the Godswood was beaten back. Jon staggered over, chest heaving. "We killed 2 White Walkers here. You got the 3rd. "We did," Jaime said. "But the Whites aren't all destroyed." Jon frowned. "Then the Night King is still out there. He's the key." A crackling roar of blue flame split the sky, answering Jon's words. They looked up through the canopy, hearts pounding. The undead dragon soared overhead, silhouetted against swirling snow clouds, its maw exhaling that terrible azure fire. Jaime's blood ran cold at the sight. The creature circled over Winterfell's walls, blasting ramparts where living archers still manned defenses. Suddenly, a second roar tore through the night. Another dragon. Greenish flames flickered in the distance. "That's Regal," Jon said, eyes alight with anxiety. "Daenerys might still be out there, trying to bring down the Night King." They all heard a thunderous impact on the far side of the castle. A crash that shook the ground. Snow flurried off the tree branches, and the defenders exchanged glances. Brienne's voice was hoarse when she said, "What do we do now?" Jon gripped his sword. "We find him. The Night King may have landed. If we don't stop him, it won't matter how many walkers we kill. The Whites will keep coming. I'm going after him." Tormund nodded. "I'll come." Brienne pushed herself up, though her armor was dented. "I'm with you." Jaime swallowed the dryness in his throat. "I won't remain behind." Even though he could hardly feel his sword arm from fatigue, he knew his place was in this final confrontation. Jon looked from one face to another. Tormund, Brienne, Jaime, Davos, Sam, the wildling men. Too few, but they were all that remained of the fighting elite in the Godswood. Jon set his jaw. "We can't all go. Some have to defend Bran." Mira Reed placed her spear but on the ground. "I'll stay with him," she said firmly. "And so will these watchers. We'll hold as long as we can. But hurry." Jon inclined his head. "Keep him safe." Then he gestured for Jaime, Brienne, Tormund, and a few others. "With me." They crossed the Godswood, stepping over destroyed Whites and the shattered remains of White Walkers. The path to the eastern wall was littered with corpses. The noise of battle still reverberated from other parts of the castle. Flames glimmered in the courtyard beyond, the flickering light revealing partial collapses of walls and entire sections ablaze. It looked like a scene from the depths of the Seven Hells. Then they saw it. A great rent in the walls near the eastern rampart, wide enough for a dragon to have crashed through. Rubble lay strewn about, and a haze of smoke drifted up from scattered fires. Amid the ruin, the colossal shape of an undead dragon loomed, half coiled on its side, jaws parted. Dark fluid seeped from a rent in its flank, perhaps a blow from Regal. The Night King stood at the beast's neck, tall and terrible, silent as death. He gazed across the courtyard with ice-blue eyes, as though searching for something. When he spotted Jon and the others approach, he lifted a hand. The undead dragon began to stir, eyes flaring with that same unholy light. Jon led the charge, brandishing Longclaw. "Night King," he bellowed. The being turned slowly, elegant in its inhuman calm. Snow swirled around him in a sudden gust, forming a miniature blizzard that whipped at the faces of the living. One by one, the corpses littering the courtyard began to twitch. Dozens of dead men in Stark or Lannister armor, old Whites scattered from earlier fights. Every corpse answered the Night King's call, rising in a macabre wave. "Gods," Tormund whispered. "He's raising them all again." "Focus on him," Jon said through gritted teeth. "Get me close enough to strike. If I can kill him, you'll have your chance," Jaime said, though doubt gnawed at him. The risen corpses lurched forward. Brienne and Tormund braced themselves. Davos clutched his dagger, trembling but resolved. It would be a nightmare fight, but there was no choice. They rushed in. The newly risen dead shambled, not yet as swift as older whites, but numerous. Jaime hacked at one soldier's corpse that had worn a Glover sigil, severing its head. Another lunged for Brienne, and she crushed it with her shield. Tormund barreled through 3 at once, swinging his axe with barbaric ferocity. Davos, sweating, stabbed a reanimated Lannister guard in the chest with dragonglass, letting out a ragged cry as it toppled. Jon forced his way through, nearing the Night King. The undead dragon roared, flames of blue crackling from its ruined maw. Jaime shouted, "Look out!" as the dragon inhaled, chest expanding, light building in its throat. Jon dove behind a chunk of fallen stone, and the dragon exhaled a lance of blazing blue. The rubble exploded in a shower of sparks, sending Jon tumbling backward. With a triumphant shriek, the dragon swiveled its huge head, intending to sweep the rest with its deadly flame. Jaime, Brienne, Tormund, and Davos scattered, seeking cover behind the collapsed rampart. The blue flame raked across the courtyard, leaving nothing but melted stone and twisted iron in its wake. Now or never, Jaime thought. If that dragon is allowed to keep blasting, we'll never reach the Night King. Summoning every last reserve of courage, Jaime sprinted from his cover, heading not for the Night King, but for the undead dragon's flank. The beast reared back, jaws yawning to unleash another torrent. Jaime skidded to a halt, crouching behind a broken catapult for half a heartbeat. The second blast of flame roared over him, turning the catapult into molten slag. Heat scorched his face even though it was an unholy, freezing flame, an impossible combination that made his flesh prickle with frostburn. When the blast subsided, Jaime leapt over the smoking debris, sword held high. He aimed for the wound in the dragon's side, where black fluid trickled. Perhaps the creature's undead flesh would succumb if struck with Valyrian steel and dragonglass. He slammed his sword into the wound, burying it as deep as he could. The dragon let out a shriek so loud it rattled Jaime's teeth. Its tail lashed violently, striking Jaime and sending him flying across the courtyard. He landed hard, pain exploding in his ribs. Spots danced before his eyes. His sword remained embedded in the dragon's flank, lodged in decaying flesh, but it would take more than that single blow to kill such a beast. A shape loomed over Jaime, the Night King, pale and cold. He stared down with ancient malevolence, as if amused. Jaime tried to scramble back, but pain in his ribs slowed him. The Night King raised his hand, conjuring a spear of ice. There was no time to evade. Jaime watched the spear lift, heart pounding in a numb haze, certain these were his final moments. A roar tore through the air, human this time. Tormund, the wildling, slammed into the Night King's flank, driving his axe at the inhuman figure's midsection. The axe shattered on contact, shards of steel raining down. The Night King scarcely flinched. He whipped around, swinging the ice spear. Tormund jumped back, but not fast enough. The spear ripped across his chest. Blood sprayed, and Tormund collapsed, gasping. The Night King turned back to finish Jaime off. An arrow whistled in, striking the Night King's head. It shattered on that icy helm, but it distracted him a second longer. Jaime recognized Davos off to the side, struggling with a bow. The Night King cast him an indifferent look, as though deciding which foe to dispatch first. Brienne stormed in from behind. She had circled around while the dragon was lashing about. Oathkeeper glinted in the faint light. She roared in defiance, bringing the blade down in a savage overhead strike. The Night King spun, catching the blade with the ice spear. Frost and sparks erupted. For a moment, they stood locked, the unholy being and the Knight of Tarth. Brienne's muscles strained, but the Night King was stronger. He twisted the spear, deflecting Oathkeeper, and then struck her across the torso with a backhand. She flew aside, armor screeching as she hit the ground. Jaime struggled to rise. Every muscle shrieked in protest, but he forced himself onto one knee. The undead dragon roared behind the Night King, still thrashing. A flash of green in the sky drew Jaime's eye, regal, plunging down with Daenerys on his back. She cried out something lost in the roar, unleashing a torrent of dragon fire. The Night King glared up, and as if in response, his undead dragon lifted its head to counter. Blue flame and green flame clashed in midair, an incandescent explosion that made the night blaze like midday for an instant. The Night King took advantage of that momentary confusion. He hurled the ice spear upward at Regal. Daenerys tried to bank aside, but the spear clipped the dragon's wing, and Regal screamed, veering off. He crashed against a portion of the castle wall, sending stones tumbling. Daenerys tumbled from the saddle, landing out of sight amidst the rubble. Jon Snow burst onto the scene then, covered in soot and blood, Longclaw in hand. His eyes burned with fury as he charged the Night King. The dark figure regarded Jon with a hint of recognition, his old nemesis. Jaime coughed, forcing himself upright. He had to help. Tormund lay bleeding, Brienne was down, Davos was too far with just a bow. That left Jaime to stand with Jon in these final seconds. Jon sprang at the Night King, slashing with Longclaw. The Night King caught the blade with his spear, an impact that set the air crackling. They exchanged blows in a flurry of movement, Jon's swift ferocity against the Night King's unnatural grace. Their blades flashed once, twice, thrice. Jon nearly disarmed the Night King with an upswing, but the spear manifested a swirl of frost, hooking around Longclaw and forcing Jon to yank back. Jaime lurched forward, ignoring his battered body. He snatched up a discarded dragonglass spear from the ground, testing its weight in his good hand. In his left was only the golden prosthetic, useless for fine maneuvering, but maybe enough to brace a weapon. The Night King hammered Jon's guard, forcing the younger man down to one knee. Longclaw's Valyrian steel glinted with cracks of frost forming on it. One more strike and Jon might be done. Jaime hurled the spear with what strength he had left, aiming for the Night King's back. He was no expert spear thrower with his remaining arm, but desperation guided him. The weapon flew true enough that the Night King had to dodge. He spun, letting the spear whistle past, fracturing as it struck the rubble. That split second gave Jon an opening. He thrust upward, Longclaw plunging into the Night King's side. The monster snarled, an almost feral sound, but did not shatter like the lesser walkers had. He seized Longclaw's blade with a hand of hoarfrost, actually gripping the steel with bare fingers. The metal screeched, freezing over. Jon tried to yank it free, but frost latched it in place. Seeing this, Jaime lunged from behind, snatching up his own sword from the undead dragon's flank. The blade was slick with dark fluid. He turned, heart hammering. The Night King was locked in a lethal grapple with Jon, who refused to let go of his sword. Jaime steadied his footing. If he missed or if the Night King moved at the wrong moment, he could kill Jon. But he had no choice. He thrust the blade forward with every last ounce of will. The tip slid between the ridges of the Night King's armor, guided by the gap Jon's sword had made. He felt a jolt as the Valyrian steel made contact with whatever unholy substance lay beneath. A flash of brilliant blue-white light flared from the wound, and a sound like cracking ice echoed. The Night King straightened, releasing Jon, turning his eerie gaze on Jaime in an almost curious way. For an instant, Jaime thought it wouldn't work. Then the cracks spread across the Night King's torso, radiating outward in jagged lines. With a final, echoing screech, the Night King erupted into 1,000 shards of ice that cascaded across the ground in a shimmering wave. The force of it knocked Jaime and Jon backward. The courtyard fell silent, save for the shifting of rubble and the distant crackle of fires. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then, throughout Winterfell, a vast moan went up, as if the wind itself were exhaling. The reanimated corpses collapsed where they stood, their blue eyes going dark. The undead dragon slumped with a thunderous crash, releasing a final, rattling roar before its glow snuffed out. Everywhere, wights tumbled, weapons clattering from lifeless hands. Jaime lay on his back, struggling to breathe through the pain in his ribs. Jon was on all fours nearby, coughing. Slowly, they both realized the dead had fallen. The Night King was destroyed. It was over. A ragged cheer broke out in the courtyard, in the walls above, and from survivors in the castle halls. Men who had braced themselves for certain doom found that the whites besieging them had crumpled into inert husks. Relief and disbelief mingled. Fires still raged in parts of Winterfell, and the stench of death hung thick, but the Great War, for now, was won. Jaime forced himself to stand, pain lancing through his side. He stumbled over to Jon, offering a hand. Jon clasped it, hauling himself upright. Their gazes met in mutual exhaustion and relief. Words were too small to encompass what they had just done. Tormund groaned, reminding them he lay wounded. Jaime rushed to his side, kneeling. The wildling's chest was slick with blood, his breathing shallow. "Hang on, Tormund," Jaime muttered. "We'll get you a maester." Tormund spat blood, trying to grin. "I fought an ice demon," he croaked. "Not so bad for a free folk." He coughed, wincing. "Go on, help the others. I'll be fine, or I'll die a good death." Jaime touched his shoulder. "You'll live." He looked around, spotting Davos stepping gingerly from behind a collapsed pillar. "Ser Davos, find a maester. Quickly." Davos nodded, rushing off. Brienne had picked herself up, limping. She held Oathkeeper in a trembling hand, scanning the courtyard to confirm the whites were truly down. When she caught Jaime's eye, relief and something else flickered across her face. Gratitude, pride, maybe both. She took a step closer, resting a hand on Jaime's arm. "We did it," she said, voice quivering with fatigue. He just nodded. Yes, they had. Together. Jon, meanwhile, hurried toward the rubble where Daenerys had fallen. Others followed, picking their way over the chunks of stone. Jaime, satisfied Tormund was receiving help, limped after them. They found Daenerys bruised and shaken but alive, pinned beneath a fallen beam. Jon, with the help of 2 soldiers, lifted the beam enough for her to crawl free. She gasped, tears of relief in her eyes, though heartbreak for the devastation around them was equally present. "My dragon?" she asked, voice cracking. "Regal's alive," Jon said softly, though clearly injured. "His wing is torn, but he's breathing." A wave of relief passed over Daenerys' face, though it was tempered by sorrow for Viserion, the undead dragon, now truly lost. One by one, the survivors gathered. Ghost limped into the courtyard, fur matted with blood. Sam and Davos arrived, guiding a pair of maesters who began tending to Tormund and the others. The entire castle was a scene of ruin, walls broken, courtyards strewn with piles of corpses. Fires and smoke lingered, but the night sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. As the final hours of darkness melted into the pale light of a new morning, the living moved through Winterfell's devastated halls, confirming that every last white had fallen inert. Groans of the wounded replaced the shrieks of the dead. Water was brought from the wells to douse the fires, and the able-bodied began clearing debris to rescue those trapped. Sansa emerged from the great hall, tears shining as she beheld the carnage. Yet her gaze lit with fierce hope when she saw that it was, at last, over. Jaime trudged through the aftermath, numb with exhaustion, side throbbing. He stopped in the courtyard to lean against a crumbling wall, letting out a shaky breath. This final stand had been everything he'd feared. Savage, apocalyptic. But they had prevailed. The price was heavy. So many had fallen, Northerners, wildlings, Lannisters who had followed him. Yet their deaths had not been in vain. Jon approached, leaning on Longclaw. He looked as though he could barely remain upright, but a spark of relief was in his eyes. "Ser Jaime," he murmured, "we owe you thanks. If you hadn't been here, He paused, swallowing thickly. "I don't think we would have won." Jaime let out a humorless laugh. "We only won because we fought together." He let his gaze wander the ruined yard. "I suppose that was the point of all this, put aside old hatreds to face the real threat. But the cost." He trailed off, still seeing the heaps of broken bodies. Jon placed a hand on Jaime's shoulder. "The cost is great, but many more would have died had we been divided." You helped us see that. Sansa joined them, her cloak stained and torn. She gave Jaime a small nod of respect. You stood with us when it mattered. The North won't forget that. In that moment, Jaime felt something lift in his chest. An old guilt, a lifetime of regrets. Perhaps he could never fully atone for all he'd done. But this was a start. Standing in the snow-choked courtyard of Winterfell, among allies who had once been bitter enemies, he felt that an uneasy peace had finally settled on the land. The long night had been pushed back, at least for now. Brienne approached quietly, her steps unsteady, though she still carried Oathkeeper. Jaime turned to her, wanting to say something profound, but finding the words elusive. She spoke first. "We survived," she said, eyes glimmering with a suppressed emotion. "Thanks to you, and to the realm's defenders." He searched her face. "You saved me more times than I can count this night. You saved us all." His voice caught. Then he settled for a simple truth. "I'm glad we fought side by side." A faint smile tugged at her lips. Then she nodded. "We have much to do now. The wounded need tending. The dead need burying. The war against the Night King was the greatest challenge, but the realm still needs to rebuild." Dawn spread across the sky, the first warm light in what felt like an eternity. Smoke from the castle's fires drifted upward, carrying the ashes of the fallen. The hush that settled over Winterfell was like the heavy quiet after a thunderstorm. Jaime drew in a deep breath of cold air, letting it fill his lungs. Despite the devastation, hope fluttered in his chest. He found Tyrion in the ensuing days. His brother arrived by horse from the south not long after the final battle, accompanied by a small retinue of Daenerys' advisors, having raced to coordinate shipments of dragonglass and troops that never made it north in time for the final stand. With the threat ended, Tyrion stepped through Winterfell's gates and beheld the aftermath. Battered walls, half-collapsed towers, funeral pyres smoking in the courtyards. When he caught sight of Jaime, a rare, unguarded relief filled his mismatched eyes. They embraced tightly, neither caring who watched. "You mad fool," Tyrion whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I thought I'd find you among the corpses. Thank the gods you live." Jaime clapped him on the back. "It was close, but we had enough men, and enough luck." Tyrion stepped back, eyeing the destruction. "And Cersei?" Jaime shook his head. "She did nothing to help us. She may try to claim the throne now that the threat is gone, or cling to it if she still holds the capital. But the North won't forget who stood for them, and who did not." In the weeks that followed, as winter's snows continued to swirl, the North mourned its dead and began to rebuild. Daenerys remained with Rhaegal, her surviving dragon, in the battered courtyard. She pledged her forces to help restore Winterfell, forging a new alliance with House Stark that might endure. Jon and Sansa welcomed Jaime's men as well. Though the banner of House Lannister drew many wary looks, the realm had changed in the crucible of the dead. Alliances were no longer only about ancient grudges. They were about survival and the possibility of a future shaped by cooperation, not by endless war. Jaime walked among the stables one crisp morning, his breath hanging in the air. He found Brienne brushing down a trembling mare, gentling the beast with soft murmurs. The stable smelled of hay and horse sweat, a comforting reminder of life going on despite everything. She glanced at him, her expression as open as it ever was. "When do you leave?" she asked quietly, continuing her gentle brushing. He hesitated. "I hadn't decided. My men might follow Tyrion south eventually, or remain to help rebuild." "What about you?" She set the brush aside, smoothing the horse's mane. "I swore an oath to protect the Stark girls. If they stay at Winterfell, I may remain to serve them. Sansa deserves to have protectors she can trust." Jaime nodded. "You do well here. The North respects you, rightly so." A long silence fell. Outside, snowdrifts sparkled in the pale morning light. Then Brienne turned to him, expression searching. "You came here once as an enemy," she said. "You have a choice now. Leave as a friend." He studied her face, remembering every trial they'd shared. The question held multiple layers. Slowly, he reached for her hand. His golden prosthetic caught a stray ray of light, but he clasped her real hand with his real one. "I've seen the cost of hatred. I have no desire to return to that." "Yes," he said softly, voice thick. "I'd leave as a friend or remain as one." Her lips curved slightly. She squeezed his hand, then released it. "Whichever you choose," she said. "I'm glad you found your honor, Jaime." He exhaled, feeling a weight lift. "Me too." In the weeks and months that followed, the realm's fate took shape. Word spread that Cersei Lannister still held King's Landing with an iron grip, prepared to punish any who opposed her. But with the army of the dead destroyed, the people had no taste for more bloodshed. Even her own bannermen began to question whether they owed her loyalty. Tales of how Jaime Lannister fought alongside the Starks and Targaryens circulated through tavern gossip, half turning him into a folk hero despite his earlier infamy. Tyrion negotiated with lords from the Reach, the Stormlands, and even Dorne, all of whom found common ground in the fact that Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow had saved the world from the Long Night. At Winterfell, a unity blossomed between the armies that remained. Northerners who had once spat at the name Lannister shared mead and stories with the survivors of Jaime's host. Wildlings continued to roam north of the Broken Wall, but some remained in the newly liberated lands, forging ties with the people they had fought beside. Rhaegal, scarred from the Night King's spear, gradually healed enough to fly short distances. The presence of a living dragon sword as a symbol that the new alliance was more powerful than any single queen claiming the Iron Throne. Jaime took to helping with repairs along the battlements. He had learned enough humility to lift stones, to gather timbers, to use his golden hand as a steady brace. Each day he saw Sansa, who now wore the mantle of Lady of Winterfell with calm assurance. Sometimes Bran would appear, eyes distant, but there was an odd serenity about him, as though his role in defeating the Night King had brought him to a final acceptance of his strange power. On one chilly morning, Jaime found himself talking to Arya Stark, newly returned from her own missions across the realm. She regarded him with a level gaze, as if measuring the man she had once blamed for her family's sufferings. She asked him bluntly why he had come to Winterfell. He answered with all the honesty he had, recounting his break with Cersei and the knowledge that the real war lay in the north. Arya's expressions were subtle and guarded, but at the end, she nodded and said, "You made the right choice," before slipping off to wherever she went, as silent as a shadow cat. The realm was not magically at peace. Politics thrummed beneath everything. Daenerys had a claim to the throne, as did Jon, though he insisted he wanted no crown. Cersei remained in King's Landing, no doubt gathering resources for a future confrontation. But for the moment, all of that paled compared to the fact that the living had survived a battle that should have ended them. Harvests and rebuilding took priority. People realized that another war would only deepen their woes, and for once, the threat of unifying under a single banner, Targaryen or Stark, seemed preferable to endless strife. Jaime spent many evenings in Winterfell's Great Hall, now restored to partial splendor. Once, the hall had rung with the screams of that terrible night. Now it echoed with the hum of carpenters repairing beams, the laughter of children running about, the murmured talk of alliances. Sansa presided over gatherings where local lords pledged fealty anew, grateful to the king in the north and the Dragon Queen for saving them. Jaime occasionally joined those gatherings, his Lannister cloak gone, replaced by simpler garb. Some gave him side glances, but the hostility had faded to a cautious acceptance. One night, at a subdued feast in honor of the fallen, Jaime stood with a cup of wine, remembering the faces lost. The boy soldier, the knights who had ridden north with him and never returned, Tormund who lay in the infirmary recovering from a near-fatal wound. The hall smelled of roasted turnips and fresh bread. Fires crackled in the hearths, driving away the chill. People murmured stories of heroic last stands, tearful recollections of loved ones, gratitude for life. Brienne came to stand beside him quietly. She bore new bruises, a faint scar along her cheek, but she carried herself with unbroken strength. Without fanfare, she lifted her own cup in a silent toast. Jaime clinked his goblet against hers. They drank, letting the hush between them speak of shared memory. Softly, Brienne said, "Many of the men who rode north with you gave their lives. They may never be sung of in the same songs that praise the great lords or the dragons, but their sacrifice matters." Jaime swallowed, his throat tight. "I'll see that they're remembered," he promised. "In Lannisport, in the Riverlands, wherever I can." "They were brave men." Brienne nodded. "It's what they deserve." She reached out, gently resting a hand on his forearm. "And so do you. You've more than earned your place here, Jaime." He found that hearing his name from her lips, softened by respect, was more valuable than any gold or crown. He rested his golden hand lightly atop hers in acknowledgement. When finally the day came that the snows began to melt, the living realm looked toward a fragile spring. Winter's harshest days were waning. The memory of the dead's onslaught would linger for generations. But perhaps it would also teach unity. Jaime stood upon Winterfell's battlements one last time, gazing out at the land that had been a battleground. Smoke no longer rose from the fields. Instead, new growth peeked through thinning drifts of snow. Beyond, roads wound southward, leading toward the uncertain future of the Seven Kingdoms. Jon and Daenerys prepared to march south eventually, not to wage war but to negotiate some form of settlement. Sansa would remain at Winterfell, ensuring the North's independence or cooperation on fair terms. Tyrion, ever the clever hand, would orchestrate treaties that might spare them all another war. The shape of the future was unclear. Yet, with the army of the dead vanquished, anything was possible. Jaime turned at the sound of boots on stone behind him. It was Brienne. She paused, the wind ruffling her short hair. "Leaving soon?" she asked, searching his eyes. He nodded. "I'll ride with Tyrion and the Queen. Whether we succeed in making peace with Cersei, that's another matter. But perhaps my presence can prevent bloodshed." He offered a faint wry smile. Who would have thought Jaime Lannister would become an ambassador for peace? Her mouth twitched in a small, approving curve. Times change, and people can too. A hush passed between them. At length, Jaime took a small step closer. "If we succeed, maybe I'll return. Or maybe you'll come south, a visitor at Casterly Rock, though it's not so grand as it once was." He let out a breath. "In truth, I don't know what tomorrow holds." Brienne met his gaze steadily. "Wherever duty takes you, just remember there's a place for you here." Then, abruptly self-conscious, she cleared her throat, turning toward the rampart. "Safe travels, Jaime." He pressed his lips together, acknowledging the depth of that invitation. "And you, Brienne of Tarth, live well." The next morning, he departed Winterfell with a small retinue, passing through the great gates that had been rebuilt, accompanied by Tyrion, Daenerys, and a column of Unsullied and Northerners who had volunteered to help keep the peace on the journey. Sansa, Jon, and Brienne stood atop the walls, watching them go. Jaime looked back once, raising his golden hand in a gesture of farewell. The north wind caught his cloak, swirling it around him. Then he faced forward, heading into the wide world beyond. Thus ended the greatest threat Westeros had ever seen, not through a single hero or a single house, but through an alliance that transcended old grudges. And at its heart stood Jaime Lannister, who had once been the Kingslayer, scorned and mistrusted. In forging a truce with the Starks, and standing with them through the long night, he found a purpose and a measure of redemption he had never thought possible. The road stretched before them, leading south to uncertain politics and the remains of a sundered realm. But for the first time, Jaime could feel hope, genuine and unclouded. He had stood beside the wolves of Winterfell in their darkest hour, and they had prevailed. Whatever trials yet awaited, they would face them not as enemies but as allies. The realm, scarred and grieving, could still stand, united by the memory of how the living overcame the dead. And in that promise of unity, Jaime found peace at last, a quiet sense of belonging that no throne or crown could ever bestow. He carried it with him under the rising sun, as winter's chill receded behind him, and the dawn of a new age spread its light over the battered lands of Westeros.